before then, I want to talk to Ben Pyle and Donogh McCarthy about two issues, actually. One is the fact that Europe's electric car sales are down to a huge degree. New data shows sales actually plummeted in many European countries last month as demand dried up. I also want to talk about Scotland because the SNP have had a shocker of a week. Have, for lots of reasons, which we'll be talking about tomorrow with John Boothman, actually, have said that that their net zero targets are unattainable and that they have to change things round. Let's talk about electric cars first. Ben and Donogh are with me. Ben, are you surprised?
I'm not surprised that EV car sales have fallen in Europe. No, energy prices have been extremely chaotic, and so has the government's decision making, particularly places like Germany, where the drop in sales figures have led, and the German government have recently, as well as these figures, have just announced that they are considering banning private vehicle use at weekends. So all of this is sending some pretty stark signals to German people and European people that their governments are completely indifferent to their needs and the way they lead their lives. And EVs, I mean, if private consumers wish to drive EVs and buy EVs, that's all well and good. But many of these new technologies have been driven by policy. Their uptake has been driven by policy, not by consumer choice. And so that's turning around now, and that's creating a lot of antipathy towards the green agenda. As many as 50% of Germans, for example, now believe that the German government should be focused on reducing energy prices rather than reducing emissions. So there's a backlash that's been created, and that's showing in these consumer figures.
Donogh, do you think this is about a backlash and consumers finally saying we've had enough, we're going to buy whichever cars we want rather than what the state tells us to?
I think it's another scare story from the Telegraph. The Telegraph's been running a campaign to destroy the move to climate action in the United Kingdom. I don't know what's going on with Chris Evans. This is a scare story. The actual truth about European EV sales is actually they're up. They're up 3%. They're down in some countries, and they're up in other countries. For example, they're up 23% in Belgium. And so overall, the picture is going in the right direction. And the positive thing about, I mean, Ben talks about...
You're disputing these statistics that the Telegraph is reporting?
No, I'm actually looking at what the Telegraph story actually said. And if you actually read it, it's actually, if you, underneath the headline, which is saying sales down, you actually read that actually across Europe, sales are up. They are down in some countries, and they actually excluded, for example, from their graph, the sales from Belgium. And actually the positive story in the United Kingdom is amazing. Just 6 years ago, we were selling 15,000 electric vehicles. Last year, we sold 300,000. And the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders say that we're on course to be selling 400,000 this year in the UK. That's up 20-fold in just 6 years. And what's the positive thing about this in terms of policy? Ben dismisses the word policy. Well, surely it is government's duty to set policy to actually clean up the air for our kids in our cities and to tackle climate change. And that's a good thing for the government to be doing. And actually the positive thing about the switch to EVs in Britain is that our air is cleaner for kids as well.
I should say that Donogh is criticising Chris Evans, the editor of the Daily Telegraph there, rather than, I think, my Virgin Radio presenter colleague, or indeed the Labour MP, Chris Evans.
Ben, you're well up to speed with your Chris Evans.
I know a lot of Chris Evanses. Ben, what do you make of what Donogh has said, that the real story here is that actually this is a success?
Well, I'm not the Telegraph, and I'm not Chris Evans, obviously. He's right to point out that in some places it's growing, but we need to look at why that is. In Britain, the growth in sales of EVs is driven by fleet cars. So there are very good incentives for companies. So, for example, at the beginning of EVs being sold in the UK, I think each car had a subsidy of £5,000. If you bought an EV, the government would give you £5,000 less off the price. And now I think that's been reduced to £3,000. And additionally, so if you're a company and you're deciding to replace your old cars, you'll get £3,000 straight off. You'll also get I think up to £850 for each charging point, and then of course you won't have to pay the congestion charge. So all of these are adding up for each car to thousands of pounds a year. and that's coming from the taxpayer, and that's being paid to, generally speaking, very well-off people.
Let me
very
ask.
well-off companies. This is a wealth transfer from poorer people. I mean, Donica makes some arguable points, but we've got to remember that this is fundamentally the net zero agenda has so far just been a wealth transfer.
That's actually not true. Absolutely
But
untrue.
of course, it's
Well,
true.
let's let Donoghue respond here.
Yeah, well, if you actually look at a range of net zero actions, so for example, making cars more efficient, making our homes more efficient, making lightings more efficient, making our fridges more efficient, we're looking at a slashing of costs for consumers over the last 10 to 15 years. Our actual energy bills have gone down relative to inflation because of those net zero actions. And some of that Ben will focus on the investments that required that reduction. But if you look at the reduction in running costs compared to the investment, it has been a positive for Britain. And I don't understand why people like Ben and Chris Evans from The Telegraph want to keep us addicted to the international global oil market, which has been a disaster for Britain's economy with its boom and bust.
Well, I'm sure Chris Evans can speak for him.
Independent, the cheapest energy now available is onshore wind, and the UK government is banning it. I don't know why Ben wants to keep us addicted to the oil markets.
Ben, is that a fair criticism? You want to keep us addicted to the oil markets?
Well, I'm being lumped in with Chris Evans, which kind of.
By the way, Chris Evans can speak for himself, and he has a national newspaper in order to do so. But let's see what Ben Pyle thinks.
I don't have a national newspaper. Look. Donica compares energy prices relative to inflation. That's not true. Energy prices have tripled since the beginning of the renewables obligation scheme, for example, and other subsidy regimes that have been brought in. The consumer's not getting a good deal out of this. Energy prices have risen and risen and risen. So it is a wealth transfer because all the costs across the economy are rising, driven by rising energy prices, because we haven't invested. I don't care whether we get our energy from gas, oil, coal, or wind, or solar power. What I'm interested in is the cost, the price of electricity for the consumers. Now, it might be true that we're using less power and less energy, but that's because it's more expensive.
No, it's not because it's so more efficient.
Well, of course it is. That's why prices have risen. That's why energy prices have tripled. And that's why people have had to economise.
Ben, let me ask you, and then Donoghue in a second, about the events in Scotland. There are lots of events in Scotland. We're going to talk about that. The SNP has had probably its worst week ever, I would argue, actually. We're going to talk about that tomorrow with John Boothman. But interestingly, the SNP has accepted that the target of a 75% reduction in emissions by 2030 was out of reach. Now their coalition partners, the Scottish Greens, are wondering whether they're going to stay in coalition with them. But maybe Ben first. I mean, clearly the SNP made a big pledge and realised that in 6 years' time they're not going to get emissions down by 75%.
We've had a problem in Britain for quite a long time where the only opposition that exists to whoever's in government is to sort of double down to argue for doubling down on the policies that whichever government there has already committed to. For example, in lockdowns, the opposition party said it wasn't early enough, it wasn't hard enough, and it wasn't long enough, right? So we have the same with an arms race, essentially, since the 2000s, to try and be the biggest champion of the green agenda. So the green agenda has never really faced the scrutiny that it needs. Everyone's saying that the government initially said it should be 60%, and the opposition party said it should be 80%. So we've had that kind of game going on a lot. And of course, there's always been competition between Scotland and Westminster about how to champion these kind of policies. And they've got too forward on their skis, if I can put it that way. Ambitions to sort of lead the green agenda have resulted in these inevitable failures. And we see that across the board. We see, the EV car sales mandates being sort of pushed back. And we see the domestic gas boiler ban sales mandates being pushed back also. So this is a reflection of that.
Okay, Donoghue, what do you think of this one from the Scottish Greens perspective, and these huge targets that actually a number of governments, including Rishi Sunak's government, but now the SNP are rowing back on?
Yeah, I think where I agree with Ben is that all agendas, whether green or brown or fossil fuel agendas, need scrutiny, and that's actually fair in a democratic society. So I do agree with them on that. I do also say that the Scottish government did overpledge in the run up to the COP conference in Glasgow. They over pledged. The UK government's climate change committee pointed that out to them, and now the reality is coming home. However, I think we shouldn't miss out the extraordinary achievements of the Scottish government in terms of electricity. They are now a net exporter of green electricity. They produce 113% of their electricity from green sources. So that's a big win. They reduce their waste emissions by 2/3, their land use by 95%. Where they're stuck is on a number of issues. They're stuck on heating, so that the installations in Scotland has collapsed, just as it has in England, which is a real disaster for poor people who need cheaper homes to heat. And secondly, they have failed on agriculture and aviation. Too many people are taking flights abroad. We need to be holidaying at home as patriots, both to support the British economy and also to tackle climate.
The great British patriot, Donogh McCarthy there, an Irishman. Thank you both very, very much indeed. We'll continue this debate, no doubt. Ben Pyle, co-founder of the Climate Debate UK, and Donogh McCarthy, climate columnist. So thank you both for that. Lots of people getting in touch about the